had been hiking for years, but I had never pushed myself the way I decided to that summer. Most of my trips before were day hikes or simple weekend loops near familiar trails, places I could navigate without much thought. That year, I wanted something different. I wanted to test myself with something long, remote, and unforgiving. I had been reading about a narrow ridge trail that crossed high above a valley and cut through steep terrain with few escape routes. The descriptions online made it sound difficult but not impossible. Some hikers warned that it wasn't for beginners, but I didn't see myself as a beginner anymore. I had a week off from work and decided I would use every single day. I packed my gear carefully, checking off everything in my notebook. Food for 7 days, water filter, stove, fuel, tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, compass, paper map, headlamp with spare batteries, knife, lightweight tarp, rope. It all went into my backpack, and I spent time adjusting the straps until the weight felt as balanced as it could. When I lifted it, it felt heavy enough to make me pause, but I told myself that after a day or two on the trail, I would get used to it. The morning I set out, the air was hot already. The sky was clear, and I could see heat waves rising off the road where I parked my car near the trailhead. I locked it, slung the backpack over my shoulders, and began walking up the dirt path that disappeared into the woods. The first stretch felt calm, almost inviting. Tall trees closed over me, and the sound of cars faded away until it was only the crunch of my boots and the faint hum of insects in the undergrowth. The ridge didn't start right away. For the first day, the trail wound steadily upward through the forest, crossing streams and patches of overgrown brush that left scratches on my legs. My shirt was damp with sweat before noon, and I stopped more than once to sip water. I tried to keep my pace steady, but the backpack dug into my shoulders, and my lower back began to ache. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing where I decided to make camp for the night. The ground was uneven, but I managed to pitch the tent and gather some sticks for a small cooking fire. I boiled water, made a simple meal, and sat watching the sun sink through the trees. As darkness settled, the forest sounds grew louder. Crickets, frogs, the occasional call of a bird. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon roof of the tent, telling myself I was ready for whatever lay ahead. The second day began with a steep climb. The ridge trail rose sharply above the treeline, and the path narrowed until the drop on either side became visible. I moved slowly, testing each step, keeping my eyes on the dirt instead of the dizzying valley below. The wind picked up as the trees thinned, and I had to steady myself more than once by grabbing rocks that jutted from the ground. My legs burned, and my lungs worked hard with each breath. By midday, I reached a section that was little more than a foot-wide strip of packed soil clinging to the side of a cliff. The slope above me was loose rock, and below me was an endless drop into trees so far down they looked like green moss. I hugged the wall, shuffling forward, trying not to think about what would happen if I slipped. The ridge stretched on endlessly, each turn revealing another section just as narrow as the one before. That night, I didn't find a good spot to camp. The trail clung to the ridge without offering flat ground, so I had to settle for a slanted patch of dirt barely wide enough to fit my tent. I hammered the stakes deep into the ground and tied the corners with rope to nearby rocks. The wind battered the fabric all night, and I slept lightly, waking every time the gusts shook the thin walls. The third day was worse. The trail grew fainter, less maintained, as though few people ever came this far. The soil crumbled in places, and I had to scramble over boulders with the heavy pack throwing me off balance. My knees began to throb from the constant strain. By afternoon, clouds gathered overhead, and the air grew cooler. I felt the first drops of rain just as I was crossing a particularly exposed section. The dirt turned slick beneath my boots, and the rocks became treacherous. I slowed down, every step deliberate, my hands raw from gripping jagged stone. The rain did not let up. By evening, I was soaked through, my jacket clinging to me, my socks squishing inside my boots. I found a small overhang and crouched beneath it, deciding to stay there for the night instead of setting up the tent in the storm. I boiled water with trembling hands, the stove sputtering in the damp air. My food tasted bland, and I had trouble swallowing it, but I forced it down because I knew I needed the energy. The wind howled through the rocks all night, and I barely slept. By the fourth day, my energy was draining faster than I could replace it. The ridge kept going, each mile harder than the last. The rain had turned sections of the trail into mudslides, and I slipped more than once, catching myself just in time. My palms were scraped raw. My thighs burned with each uphill push. The pack seemed heavier than when I started, as though the weight had doubled. Around midday, I came to a section that stopped me cold. A rock slide had wiped out part of the path. What remained was a slope of loose gravel tilted at a steep angle, ending in a vertical drop. Crossing it meant crawling across unstable ground with nothing solid to hold onto. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding, knowing that going back wasn't an option. I finally dropped to my hands and knees and began inching across, each movement sending small rocks tumbling into the abyss. My breath came in short bursts, my eyes fixed on the far side. When I finally pulled myself onto stable ground again, I lay flat on my stomach, chest heaving, sweat mixing with the rain still dripping from the cliffs. That night, I managed to find a small flat area sheltered by low bushes. I pitched the tent and crawled inside, my muscles shaking uncontrollably from exhaustion. I ate little, too tired to cook properly. My body ached in every joint, and my skin stung from cuts and bruises. The fifth day was when I started to realize I might not make it. My food supply was running low, and I had miscalculated the distance. The ridge stretched on farther than I expected. My map showed a possible exit trail, but it was still days ahead, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to reach it. My water filter was working, but every stream I came across meant climbing down dangerous slopes just to refill. Each trip left me weaker. By late afternoon, I felt lightheaded, my steps unsteady. I stopped more often, sitting on rocks, my chest heaving. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of pine and wet soil. I pressed on, one foot in front of the other, telling myself I had to keep moving no matter how much it hurt. That evening, the sky cleared, and the sun broke through in streaks of orange light. The valley below looked endless, a green sea stretching in every direction. I should have felt a sense of accomplishment, but instead I felt dread. I was too high, too exposed, and too far from safety. I pitched my tent again on slanted ground, unable to find anything better. My sleep was broken by nightmares of falling. On the sixth day, my body felt like it was shutting down. My legs trembled constantly, my mouth was dry, and my stomach cramped from hunger. I rationed my food to the smallest bites, but it did little to give me strength. My mind drifted in and out, sometimes losing track of time. The trail grew more dangerous, the drops sharper, the ground looser. I slipped and caught myself so many times that my arms felt bruised from elbow to wrist. Late that day, I finally spotted something that looked like the exit trail marked on my map. It cut down the ridge into dense forest below. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with fear. The descent looked steep and unforgiving, switchbacking through loose dirt and boulders. My legs were already giving out, and I knew the risk of falling was high. But I also knew I had no choice. The descent was worse than I imagined. The path dropped sharply, and the soil gave way beneath my boots. I clutched at branches, roots, anything that could slow me down. At one point, I lost my footing completely and slid several feet, my backpack dragging me down, until I slammed into a tree that stopped me just short of a cliff edge. My ribs ached from the impact, but I forced myself up, shaking, couldn't stop. Hour after hour, I fought my way down, slipping, stumbling, my knees screaming with pain. Darkness began to fall, and I realized I wouldn't make it to the bottom before night. I had to camp one last time, but I found only a small patch of ground barely wide enough for me to curl up. I didn't bother with the tent. I lay under the open sky, shivering, staring at the stars that blurred as my eyes drifted shut. When dawn came on the seventh day, I pushed myself upright and began again. My body felt broken, but the forest below was closer now, and I forced my legs to move. Step by step, slipping, catching myself, I went down. The air grew thicker with the smell of pine, and the sound of birds grew louder. Finally, after what felt like forever, the ground leveled out, and I stumbled onto a wider trail that looked. I had always loved hiking. The quiet of the woods, the steady sound of my boots on dirt and gravel, the way my breathing fell into rhythm with the slope of the ground. It all gave me a kind of peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. On weekends, I often searched for new places to go, and over the years I had gotten more confident, choosing longer trails, rougher climbs, and wilder areas that most people stayed away from. When I planned this trip, I thought it would be like any other. I had a long weekend free, so I picked a trail that ran through a section of forest I hadn't explored before. It was remote, the kind of place where you could walk all day without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed food for 2 nights, enough water, a filter, and a tent. My pack felt heavy as I hoisted it onto my shoulders, but I had carried heavier before. The air was cool when I set off that morning, the kind of cool that makes you feel strong. The first few hours were easy. The trail started wide, cut through tall pines that stood in long straight lines like pillars, with brown needles soft underfoot. Sunlight slanted through them in narrow beams, and the air smelled sharp and clean. I moved quickly, enjoying the silence. The only sounds came from small things: the call of a bird, the scurrying of something in the undergrowth, the crunch of my boots when the dirt grew dry. I stopped once to check the map, making sure the trail markers lined up with where I was. They did, and I felt good knowing I was right on track. Around midday, the trail narrowed. It rose into steeper ground, rocks jutting up in uneven shapes, roots thick and twisted across the dirt. I slowed my pace. My shoulders ached with the weight of the pack, but I kept going, drinking from my bottle now and then. The forest grew denser here. The light dimmed, shadows stretching across the path. I had the sense that the world outside the trail didn't exist anymore. Like all that was real was the strip of dirt ahead of me and the walls of trees on either side. By late afternoon, I had gone farther than most casual hikers ever would. I hadn't seen another person all day, not even an old footprint. That was the way I liked it. But as the hours passed, I felt a small unease build in my chest. I brushed it off as simple tiredness, the kind that comes after a long hike, but still it lingered. I had planned to camp by a small creek marked on the map, a place where the trail bent close to water. I expected to hear it before I saw it, but the woods were strangely quiet. When I finally reached it, the water ran low and slow, more of a trickle than a stream. The bank was muddy, and I had to step carefully to avoid sinking. I filled my bottle, filtered it, and drank. Tasted earthy, but clean enough. I set up my tent in a clearing a short distance away. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the air cooled quickly. I ate a meal from my pack, something dry and salty, and sat listening to the sounds of the forest settle into night. Normally, I enjoyed this part of hiking most, the calm of being far away from everything. But that night, the stillness felt different. There were no insects buzzing, no frogs by the water, no owls in the trees, just silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. When darkness came fully, I crawled into my tent and zipped the door closed. The ground was uneven, and I shifted for a while before I found a position that didn't hurt my back. My mind wouldn't quiet. I kept thinking about how far I was from anyone else, how long it would take for another person to reach me if something went wrong. It wasn't fear exactly, just a gnawing awareness. Sometime in the night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was only the wind, but the air outside was still. Then I heard it again, a sharp crack, like a branch breaking under weight. It came from the trees near the creek. I froze, heart thumping hard. Animals could make that sound, I told myself. Deer, maybe even a bear. But the silence after was worse. I lay awake for hours, every small noise making me tense. When dawn came, I packed up quickly. I wanted to keep moving. My plan was to follow the trail up to a ridge and loop back on a different path the next day. But as I started walking, I felt the nagging thought that maybe I should cut the trip short. I pushed it aside and kept going. The trail grew rougher. It climbed steadily, switchbacks cutting across steep slopes. Rocks slid under my boots. Sweat ran down my back. My pack seemed heavier with each step. The forest closed in tighter here, the trees leaning inward as if to swallow the trail. I stopped often to catch my breath, taking slow swallows of water. By mid-morning, I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker in hours. The last one had been a faded slash of paint on a tree, but since then, nothing. I pulled the map out, unfolded it carefully, and tried to match the bends of the trail to the lines on the page. It didn't fit. I thought maybe I had missed a turn, so I backtracked, scanning the trees for signs. Nothing. My chest tightened. I walked slower, checking every tree, every rock for paint or carved blazes. The ground looked disturbed in places, but not enough to be sure. The farther I went, the more unsure I became. The trail seemed to fade, narrowing until it was barely more than a faint line through the undergrowth. Then suddenly it was gone. I stood in the middle of the woods with no path under my feet, just thick grass and fallen branches. Panic rose hot in my throat. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had a compass. I had a map. If I could orient myself, I could get back. I tried, turning the map, lining the compass needle, picking a direction that should lead me toward the main trail. I started walking. First, I thought I was doing fine. The ground sloped in the right way, and I recognized a ridge line from the map. But as the hours dragged on, nothing matched. The forest stretched the same in every direction. I couldn't find the creek, couldn't find any sign of a path. I was moving, but it felt like I was walking in circles. My water ran low. I stopped by a shallow pool and filtered more, but it tasted stale. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but I only ate a little. I needed to make the food last in case I didn't find the trail soon. The thought made my chest tighten again. By late afternoon, my legs shook with every step. I decided to make camp early, before I grew too tired to think. I set up my tent in a small clearing, though I didn't feel safe there. The silence pressed even harder. Again, no birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint rustle of the trees. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was only animals. But in the dark, every sound felt sharper, closer. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through the undergrowth. I lay still, holding my breath, until it faded. My skin crawled. The next morning, I tried again. I picked a direction and walked. The forest looked endless. My boots rubbed blisters raw on my heels. The straps of my pack dug into my shoulders until they burned. Still, I pushed forward, certain that eventually I had to cross a road or a clearer path. Hours passed. The sun rose high, then slid down again. My throat grew dry even as I drank. My legs trembled under me. Every time I thought I saw something ahead, a break in the trees, a line of light, it turned out to be nothing. The woods seemed to stretch without end, twisting me deeper inside. By the second night, I was shaking with exhaustion. I forced myself to eat more food, though my stomach clenched. I lay in the tent, staring at the ceiling of fabric, listening to the endless silence outside. I thought about how no one knew exactly where I was, how long it would take for anyone to start looking, how wide the forest spread around me. When morning came again, I knew I couldn't keep wandering blindly. I decided to follow the sun, keep it on one side of me all day. If I kept walking straight, I told myself, I had to reach something eventually. I staggered on, my legs dragging, my head pounding. By midday, I stumbled into a patch of open ground. My heart leapt, thinking it was a road, but it was only an old clearing overgrown with grass. I fell to my knees, too tired to stand for a moment. The world spun around me. I forced myself up and kept going. My breaths came ragged, my vision blurred at the edges. I stumbled on roots, caught myself on tree trunks, dragged my feet forward. Late in the day, I heard something new. A low hum, faint but steady. I froze, listening. It grew louder. I pushed toward it, heart racing. Then I saw it. A power line cutting through the trees, stretching in a straight line overhead. Relief hit me so hard my knees gave out. I knew that if I followed it long enough, it had to lead to a road, to people. I dropped my pack because I couldn't carry it anymore. I left it lying in the dirt and walked under the wires, step by step, each one like lifting a stone. The sun slid low, but I didn't stop. Finally, when the sky grew dark, I saw the faint glow of headlights through the trees. I had been planning the hike for weeks. It wasn't anything too wild at first glance, just a long backcountry trail through a national forest that stretched for miles. I had done other long hikes before, but never this far out, never this deep into a stretch of land where there were no nearby towns, no highways close enough to hear, and no signs of people once you stepped off the trailhead. That was what I wanted, though. I wanted to be away from everything, away from the noise of the city, away from work, away from the daily routine that had worn me down. I thought this hike would clear my head. I told myself I wanted peace and quiet, but I didn't fully think about what real silence feels like until I was in it. The morning I left, the air was cool and damp. The trail started near an old gravel parking lot, the kind of place that looked abandoned most of the time except for a faded map nailed to a wooden board. I signed my name in the trail register, a little notebook in a metal box where people wrote down when they entered and when they expected to be back. I didn't think too much about it at the time. It just felt like a formality. The trail started simple, packed dirt winding through trees with occasional wooden markers nailed to posts to reassure hikers that they were still going the right way. At first, I was enjoying it the way I imagined I would. Birds were chirping in the distance. The smell of pine needles filled the air, and the crunch of my boots on the ground matched the steady rhythm of my breathing. Felt good to move, to be carrying everything I needed on my back. The first few hours slipped by without much thought. I kept track of the distance by glancing at my map and checking landmarks, streams, big boulders, certain clearings. I had planned to hike at least 12 miles the first day before setting up camp. I liked the thought of pushing deep into the woods right away. I figured if I got far enough in, I'd avoid the chance of running into anyone else. But the deeper I went, the more the woods started to change. The trail markers became less frequent, and when they did appear, some were so faded that I had to walk right up to them to be sure what they were. The trees grew closer together too, blocking more and more of the sunlight as the day went on. I started checking my map more often, stopping to make sure I wasn't wandering off trail. By mid-afternoon, I was sweating heavily. My shirt stuck to my back, and the straps of my pack rubbed against my shoulders. I thought about stopping early, but I told myself I needed to keep pushing. I didn't want to camp too close to the start. I wanted that sense of isolation. It wasn't until I stopped to rest at a fallen log that I realized how quiet it had become. Earlier, I could hear birds, the buzz of insects, even the distant sound of water when I crossed a stream. But now, when I sat there and tried to catch my breath, all I could hear was the faint sound of wind moving through the trees. No birds, no bugs, nothing. I tried to tell myself it was just because of the time of day, maybe the animals were less active. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt something unnatural about the silence. I picked myself up and kept going. I thought if I just focused on hiking, I wouldn't notice it as much. The ground sloped uphill and I had to slow down, taking one step at a time, pushing through the strain in my legs. When I finally reached the top of the ridge, I checked my watch. It was later than I expected. The sun was already dipping lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I still hadn't found a flat, clear space to set up camp. I walked faster, scanning both sides of the trail for any open ground. My heart beat harder, not just from exertion but from the unease that had started building in me since the silence settled in. At last, I found a small clearing just off the trail, barely wide enough for my tent. It wasn't perfect, the ground was uneven, and there were roots sticking up, but I didn't care. I needed to stop. Setting up the tent took longer than it should have. My hands felt clumsy, and I kept glancing into the trees around me, half expecting to see something standing there. Nothing was, of course, just dark trunks, shadows, and the occasional sway of branches in the breeze. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When camp was ready, I ate a quick dinner from one of the packets I brought, then tried to relax. I sat on a log, staring at the dim light through the canopy, listening to the faint rustle of wind. I kept waiting for some sign of life, an owl, a cricket, anything. but the forest stayed dead quiet. By the time I crawled into my tent, I was tense. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't settle. I lay there on my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric above me, hearing nothing but my own breathing. Every tiny sound outside made me freeze. The snap of a twig, the crunch of leaves. Normally, I'd tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through, but with the silence around me, each noise seemed sharper, deliberate. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. My heart was pounding, though I didn't remember dreaming. It was darker than before, pitch black except for the faint glow of the moon through the nylon. That's when I heard it. Not far from my tent, something moved. Slow, careful steps pressing into the ground. I held my breath. The steps weren't heavy, but they weren't small either. They crunched steadily, pausing, then moving again, circling. I stared at the walls of my tent, my body stiff, every muscle tight. The sound stopped right outside. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, faster and faster, as if it was trying to break out of my chest. Minutes passed. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay there waiting for something to happen. Finally, the sound shifted away, fading slowly until there was nothing again. I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake, counting the hours, staring at the dim outline of the ceiling until the sky finally began to lighten. When morning came, I stepped outside, my legs shaky, my eyes scanning the clearing. The ground was disturbed in places, patches of flattened leaves and scuffed dirt. At first I thought it might have been a deer, but the prints didn't look like hooves. They looked more like boot prints. I felt sick. I hadn't seen a single other person since I started. I hadn't even seen signs of anyone else out here, but someone had been near my tent in the night. Someone had walked around me while I lay there frozen inside. I thought about packing up and heading back, but I was already far out. Turning back would mean retracing miles. The fastest way out was forward. That's what I told myself as I broke camp quickly, shoving everything into my pack with clumsy hands. The trail grew rougher as I moved on. The markers became rare, and at times I wasn't sure if I was still on the right path. I checked my map constantly, comparing the bends in the trail to the lines on the paper. Each time I stopped, I felt exposed, like something could be moving through the trees behind me. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker even though the sky was clear. The trees pressed in thicker, their branches clawing at the trail, making it harder to move quickly. Every so often, I thought I heard movement behind me. Not constant, just a snap, a shift, something breaking. I stop, listen, hold my breath. Nothing. Then I'd start again, faster this time, my chest tightening. By late afternoon, I knew I had to find another place to camp. My body was exhausted, my feet sore, my shoulders aching from the pack. I found a spot near a ridge where the ground leveled out. It wasn't much better than the night before, but I didn't have the strength to keep looking. I set up the tent quickly, ate without tasting anything, and climbed inside before the light was fully gone. My hands shook as I zipped the entrance closed. I told myself it would be fine, that I just needed to make it through one more night before I was closer to the other side of the trail. But as soon as darkness settled, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, moving through the trees. This time, they didn't stop at the edge of camp. They came closer. I froze, clutching my sleeping bag tight, my ears straining. The steps circled, then paused right outside my tent again. I could hear breathing, not heavy, but close. Someone was standing there, inches from me, separated only by the thin nylon wall. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. The person didn't leave right away. They stood there, silent, as if listening to me the way I was listening to them. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound shifted again, moving slowly into the trees until it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn came, I packed up faster than I ever had. My hands trembled as I shoved my gear into my bag. I didn't even bother eating. I just started moving. The trail was harder to follow now. The map didn't seem to match what I was seeing. I kept losing the path, then finding it again, each mistake making me more desperate. I couldn't stop thinking about the prints, the steps, the breathing outside my tent. Someone was following me, someone who knew the woods better than I did. By midday, I was sweating and stumbling, my body weak. I tripped over roots, scraped my I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea was simple. A solo hike into the mountains, nothing too extreme, just long enough to challenge me and give me space to clear my head. I had always loved being outdoors, away from traffic and phone screens, where the only sound was the wind pushing through the trees or the steady crunch of my boots over dirt and stone. It gave me something regular life didn't. A sharp reminder that I was small, that nature was huge, and that I was walking on ground older than anything else I knew. The trail I picked was one I had read about online. It wasn't one of those tourist-heavy loops where families dragged coolers and dogs along for a short walk. This one was listed as moderate to difficult, stretching several miles uphill with switchbacks, rocky ledges, narrow sections carved into the side of cliffs, and parts that bent deep into dense woods where light barely touched the ground. That was the reason I picked it. I wanted something real, something that wasn't smoothed out or manicured. I set out early in the morning. The air was crisp, and the kind of cold that only comes before the sun fully climbs. My backpack was heavy, full of the usual things: food, water, a first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, matches, and a rain jacket. I had checked the forecast a dozen times before leaving, but mountains have their own weather, and I didn't want to take chances. The trail started smooth enough, dirt packed tight from years of boots pressing it down. Fallen leaves lay across the ground, damp from the night before, sticking to the soles of my shoes. I walked fast at first, excited and full of energy. My lungs pulled in the cool air, and I could feel my muscles warming up with the climb. As I gained height, I began to see stretches of the valley below. At first, it was only glimpses through breaks in the trees, then wider views as the forest thinned on the higher slopes. Far below, the green fields and winding road looked like they belonged to another world. Up here, it was only me, the trees, and the sound of my own steps. The higher I went, the rougher the trail became. Roots coiled out of the ground like ropes, waiting to catch careless feet. Stones poked through the dirt, slick from the damp air, shifting when I put my weight on them. In places, the path narrowed to little more than a shelf of rock no wider than my boots, and I pressed myself against the cold mountain wall to make sure I didn't slip. One mistake, one misplaced step, and I knew gravity would drag me down before I could even think about grabbing onto anything. Hours passed. I kept moving higher. I took short breaks to drink water and rest my legs, then pushed on. By noon, I reached a section that had always been described as the hardest part. A long stretch of switchbacks cut into loose gravel that seemed to go on forever. The sun was higher now, beating down between gaps in the trees, and sweat ran down my back. Every step up the incline slid a little before catching. It was like climbing an endless staircase where each stair tried to push you back down. I was breathing heavy, but I didn't stop. I forced myself forward until I finally reached the top, where the path leveled for a while and moved into thick forest again. Shade cooled me as I walked beneath tall pines that creaked in the wind. The air smelled like resin and damp earth. For a time, everything felt calm. But as I went deeper into the trees, the quiet started to change. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, the kind of thing you don't notice right away until it finally hits you that something feels wrong. The forest grew still, too still. Normally, even deep in the woods, you hear birds calling or the rustle of squirrels in the branches. But here, nothing moved. No sound at all except for my footsteps. I slowed down, my ears strained for anything. A branch snapping, leaves shifting, but the silence pressed against me like a weight. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself animals were simply resting, or maybe the air had shifted, making things quieter. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept going deeper into the forest. The trail was clear but narrow, cutting through thick undergrowth that rose high on either side. The trees leaned overhead, blotting out most of the light. I felt boxed in, like I had stepped into a tunnel of wood and leaves. That was when I noticed something else. On the side of the trail, half hidden under fallen branches, was a boot. It looked old, the leather cracked, laces broken. Dirt covered most of it, as if it had been there a long time. I stared at it for a moment, wondering who it belonged to, why it was left behind. Then I noticed something else. Not far from the boot, scattered across the ground, were other scraps. A torn strap from a backpack, a crushed water bottle, what looked like a piece of cloth, faded and frayed. I froze. My heart thudded heavy in my chest. There was no reason for those things to be here. This wasn't near a campsite. It wasn't near a trailhead where someone might dump trash. These were things that had been used, carried, and then left. I crouched, looking closer. The cloth was stiff with dirt, but I could tell it had once been part of a shirt. The backpack strap was snapped, not cut clean, more like it had been torn. The longer I stared, the more unsettled I felt. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone got lost and dropped these things. Maybe they had been here for years, forgotten. But the trail was marked, and while it was tough, it wasn't the kind people usually vanished on. I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands. My throat felt dry. I wanted to keep moving, to put distance between myself and that strange pile, but the silence of the forest seemed to press closer now. I walked faster. My boots crunched against the path, and the sound seemed too loud in the still air. Every few steps, I looked behind me, half expecting to see something moving through the trees. Nothing did, but the feeling didn't fade. It grew heavier, like invisible eyes were following me. The trail climbed again, steeper this time, winding through rocks and gnarled roots. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I just wanted out of that forest, back to open space where I could see everything around me. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trees began to thin. I stepped into a clearing where the ground sloped upward toward a ridge. The sun hit me full in the face, blinding after the dim woods. I stopped, catching my breath, then looked back at the trail behind me. The trees stood still, shadows dark between their trunks. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the thought of the boot, the torn strap, the broken silence. I turned back to the ridge and kept climbing. I had been planning the hike for weeks. I wanted something challenging but not impossible. Something that would push me out of my comfort zone but still feel like I had control over it. I chose a trail in late summer that cut deep into the mountains, about 25 miles in total if you followed it from start to finish. The maps showed sharp climbs, narrow switchbacks, and long stretches through dense woods with no quick way out once you were committed. That was the draw for me, being so far from roads and noise and people. I packed carefully, a medium pack with a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 4 days, water filter, headlamp, knife, rope, and a first aid kit. I also had bear spray and a whistle tied to my shoulder strap. My boots were already broken in from shorter trips, and I wore thick socks. I checked the forecast and it showed clear skies for the next 3 days, with a chance of rain on the 4th. That sounded perfect. The trail started easy. A gravel path wound upward through fields that were already turning yellow from the heat of summer. It was early morning and the air was cool. I could hear nothing but birds and the crunch of gravel under my boots. After about a mile, the path narrowed, and soon I was under the canopy of trees. The forest felt heavy, still damp from the night. The air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, but down on the trail it was dim and cool. I moved at a steady pace. The trail wasn't crowded. I had only seen 2 cars at the trailhead parking lot. By mid-morning, I had already climbed several switchbacks and could feel the weight of the pack pressing on my shoulders. My shirt was damp with sweat. The woods grew thicker the higher I went, and I could no longer see far in any direction. The ground was covered with ferns, moss, and fallen branches. Every so often, I thought I heard movement in the trees, but when I stopped and listened, there was nothing but the sound of wind brushing leaves. Around noon, I found a flat spot beside a small stream and took a break. I filtered water into my bottles and ate a sandwich. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. I sat for about 20 minutes, then strapped on my pack and kept moving. The trail got steeper after that. Roots crossed the ground like veins, and I had to watch every step so I wouldn't trip. At one point, I slipped on loose dirt and caught myself against a tree. My palms burned, but I was fine. I pushed upward, sweating hard, the muscles in my legs aching. Hours passed like that, just climbing, listening to my own breath, feeling the straps dig into my shoulders. I stopped again mid-afternoon for water. That was when I noticed something. In the dirt at the edge of the trail, there were tracks. Not boots, not shoes. They were wider, spaced strangely, with a deep heel and almost no imprint at the front. My first thought was maybe someone hiking barefoot, but the size and depth didn't look right. They seemed heavier, uneven. I stared at them for a long time, then shrugged it off. Maybe some animal, though I couldn't place it. I kept moving. As the day wore on, the trail leveled for a while. I came to a clearing where sunlight poured in, lighting up the grass and wildflowers. I felt a small wave of relief being out of the dense trees for once. I crossed the meadow, then the trail dipped back into the forest. Shadows were longer now. I knew I needed to think about camping soon. I found a flat area tucked just off the trail beneath some tall pines. I dropped my pack, stretched, and set up my tent. The air was cooler now, and mosquitoes buzzed around. I boiled water, ate noodles, and sat on a rock watching the light fade. The forest grew dark quickly. I zipped myself inside the tent, turned off my headlamp, and lay listening. At first, it was nothing but crickets and the faint rush of wind through the trees. But later, when the forest had settled, I thought I heard something else. A crack, a snap, the sound of a branch breaking not far away. I held my breath. Came again, faint but sharp. Then silence. I told myself it was an animal. A deer maybe, but the sound had weight to it, like something heavy pressing down. I stayed awake for a long time, staring into the dark, before I finally drifted off. The next morning I woke stiff but rested. The air was damp and cool. I boiled water for coffee, packed my gear, and started again. The trail climbed harder that day, steeper and rockier. Sweat ran down my back and soaked my shirt. I slipped more than once, catching myself on branches. At one point, I stopped to breathe and noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, just stillness, pressed on me thick and heavy. I shifted uneasily, drank some water, and kept going. Later in the afternoon, I came across more tracks in the dirt. The same as before, wide, heavy, not shaped like boots. They cut across the trail, then disappeared into the brush. The soil was pressed deep, like something carrying weight had moved fast. The rest of that day felt different. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I was being watched. Every crack of a branch, every shift of leaves, made me stop and scan the woods. I saw nothing, but the feeling didn't leave me. That night, I camped farther off the trail, thinking it would give me more privacy. I set up quickly, ate, and crawled into the tent as the sky darkened. Again, as I lay there, I heard movement, heavier this time, a shuffle, a step, then silence. My heart hammered. I held the bear spray in my hand, my thumb ready. I stayed awake most of the night, eyes wide in the dark. By morning, I was exhausted, but I forced myself to pack up and keep going. The trail ahead was narrow and cut along a steep slope. On one side, the mountain dropped away, on the other side, trees pressed close. I moved carefully, testing each step. That was when I saw it. In the dirt ahead, at the edge of the trail, was something dark. I bent down. A piece of cloth, torn, dirty, snagged on a branch. Not old, it hadn't been there long. My stomach tightened. As I moved on, I noticed more. Another piece of fabric tangled in roots. A boot print pressed deep into the soil. Then, far off, the faint sound of movement again quickened my pace. The trail twisted, and the woods closed in tighter. My breath came fast, and every muscle in my body was tense. When I finally reached a small ridge with a view, I stopped and looked back. Nothing, just endless trees swaying in the wind. But the feeling was still there. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I didn't dare stop. I kept walking even as the light faded, stumbling over roots in the dark with only my headlamp lighting the way. My legs screamed in pain, but the thought of stopping felt worse. At some point deep into the night, I heard it again, a branch snapping, closer this time. I froze, my light sweeping across the trees. Nothing but black trunks and brush. I forced myself to keep moving. I don't know how many hours passed before I found myself back near the end of the trail. My body was shaking, my feet blistered, my throat dry. When I finally saw the thin strip of gravel road through the trees, I nearly collapsed. I stumbled out, dropped my pack, and stood there breathing hard. My whole body trembled with relief. I never saw anyone. I never found out what was following me. But I know it was there. The tracks, the torn cloth, the weight of footsteps in the dark. Those weren't in my head. Something had been moving through those woods with me, keeping pace, staying close but never close enough to see. I drove away that day, every nerve in my body still raw. And I knew one thing clearly: I would never go back to that trail again. I always enjoyed hiking alone. For me, being out in the forest or in the mountains was a way to escape the noise of life. It was where I could clear my mind, let my thoughts settle, and push myself physically at the same time. I was never careless about it. I always carried enough water, food, maps, a compass, extra clothes, and a first aid kit. I had been on plenty of trips before, some lasting only a day, some over a weekend, and I thought I had grown used to the way the wild could test me. But one trip made me realize how quickly things could change, how thin the line was between peace and danger. It started with a plan to hike a trail that I had read about in an old hiking magazine. The article had described it as less traveled, remote, and demanding. That was what drew me in. The trail cut through rough terrain, passed by ridges, crossed a few rivers, and wound through thick forest before connecting with another route that led back down to civilization. It was supposed to take about 2.5 days if I kept a steady pace. I wanted the solitude and challenge, so I packed everything carefully and made sure I told someone where I was going. The first morning was calm. The air was cool, and the forest felt fresh. I started on a small dirt road that quickly narrowed into a trail surrounded by thick pine and oak. The ground was damp from rain a few days earlier, and the smell of wet leaves hung heavy in the air. I moved steadily, my backpack pressing against my shoulders but still comfortable. The rhythm of hiking settled in. The crunch of boots on soil, the sound of my own breathing, the occasional bird call echoing from somewhere above. As hours passed, the forest thickened, and the trail became narrower. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been on the trail recently. The silence grew deeper the farther I went. At first it felt peaceful, but eventually it began to feel heavy, as if the forest were swallowing up sound. Even my footsteps seemed quieter, muted by moss and damp earth. By afternoon, I had reached a ridge that overlooked a long stretch of rolling forest. The view was wide and green, stretching out to distant mountains. I sat down, ate some food, and drank water while watching the wind bend the treetops. That moment felt like what I had come for. Silence, distance from people, the sense of being far away. After resting, I adjusted my pack and continued. The trail soon began to dip downward, leading me deeper into the trees. As the sun lowered, shadows stretched long across the ground, and the temperature dropped. I had planned to camp near a small stream that was marked on the map, so I kept going until I found it. By the time I reached it, the light had almost gone. I set up my tent quickly, boiled water for food, and settled in. The sound of the stream running nearby was steady and calming. That night I had trouble sleeping. It wasn't because of noises. There weren't any other than the water. It was the silence beyond the stream, the thickness of the forest pressing close. I kept waking up and checking outside, making sure my food was tied up properly away from the tent, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved. Still, unease sat in me, a feeling I couldn't explain. Eventually, I dozed off again, waking when dawn finally broke. The second day, I continued deeper along the trail. The forest floor became rougher, with rocks and fallen trees forcing me to climb or detour. At one point, I slipped while crossing a wet log, catching myself hard with my hands. The ground was muddy, and my clothes picked up dirt. My left wrist ached from the way I had landed, but I could still move it. I shook it off and pushed forward. The trail began to climb again, steeper this time. Sweat soaked through my shirt as I made my way up. My legs burned with the effort, and my breathing grew louder in my own ears. I paused often, drinking water, stretching my back against the weight of the pack. I checked the map and compass often, making sure I was still on the right track. Everything lined up, but the terrain was slower than I had expected. By late afternoon, I realized I wasn't making the progress I had planned. The trail markers were harder to spot, some of them faint or overgrown. I had to search for them carefully. Once or twice, I almost stepped off in the wrong direction, catching myself only by double-checking with the compass. The forest grew darker earlier than I expected because of the thick canopy overhead. I started thinking about where I could set camp, but the ground was uneven, covered with rocks and roots. Finally, after struggling over a ridge, I found a small clearing. It wasn't perfect, but it was flat enough to set up my tent. I worked quickly, the fading light pushing me to hurry. By the time I had my tent up, the woods around me had gone dark. I lit my small camp stove, ate a quick meal, and then packed everything away. Again, the silence pressed in. That night, the unease was worse. Lying in the tent, I kept hearing faint sounds. Twigs snapping, the brush shifting. Every time I sat up and listened, everything went still again. I told myself it was animals, maybe deer or smaller creatures moving in the night. But the sounds always seemed close, too close. I held my flashlight in my hand, waiting, listening. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, though my sleep was shallow and restless. The next morning, I felt drained. My body was sore from the uneven ground, and my mind felt heavy from lack of good sleep. I packed slowly, forcing myself to eat something even though I had no appetite. I checked the map again and realized I was behind schedule. If I wanted to make it back on time, I would need to push harder today. I tightened my pack and kept moving. The trail grew rougher still. It narrowed into faint tracks, sometimes disappearing into brush that I had to push through. The ground angled steeply up and down, my legs straining with each climb. At one point, I had to cross a stream over slick rocks. My boots slipped, and cold water soaked my socks before I managed to catch myself. The chill bit into my feet as I kept walking. As the day stretched on, I noticed the trail markers were fewer and harder to find. More than once, I had to backtrack when I realized I was going the wrong way. The forest here felt untouched, wild in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. The trees were larger, the undergrowth thicker. Light barely broke through the canopy, leaving everything in a dim, green glow. By late afternoon, I knew something was wrong. The trail was gone. I had followed what I thought was a marker, but it led to nothing but dense forest. I pulled out my map, checked the compass, tried to line everything up, but nothing seemed to match anymore. I tried backtracking, but the ground was so uneven and covered in undergrowth that I couldn't tell which way I had come. The realization hit me slowly but hard. I was lost. My chest tightened as I stood there, trying to steady my breathing. I forced myself to focus. I still had food, water, and supplies. I had a compass. If I picked a direction and stuck to it, I would eventually hit a landmark, a ridge, or maybe even find the trail again. Panic would only make things worse. I decided to head west, following the compass. The terrain fought me every step. Thick brush tore at my clothes, fallen trees blocked my way, and rocks made the ground uneven. Progress was slow, each step draining more of my energy. The weight of the pack grew heavier, my shoulders aching. As the sun dropped lower, I looked desperately for a place to stop. The forest seemed endless, the ground too rough for camp. Finally, I found a narrow space between two massive trees where the ground was almost flat. I set up my tent, but the feeling of unease was stronger than ever. This wasn't a campsite, it was just a desperate choice. That night, I hardly slept at all. Every sound made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the crack of branches, the distant hoot of an owl. My mind ran in circles, imagining larger animals moving through the brush, or worse, the thought of being truly alone out here with no way out. At some point, I must have drifted into a shallow sleep, because I woke to the faint gray light of morning feeling more exhausted than when I had lain down. I packed up with stiff hands, forced myself to eat, and checked the compass again. My plan was the same: keep heading west. The day dragged on as I stumbled over rocks, pushed through brush, and climbed ridges. My legs burned, my feet ached from the soaked socks, and my wrist throbbed from the earlier fall. My water was running low now, and I was rationing it carefully. When I finally found a small stream trickling through the rocks, I felt a surge of relief. I filtered and refilled my bottles, drank deeply, and sat for a long time just letting the water run cold across my hands. But the relief didn't last. I still had no trail, no landmark, nothing to guide me but the compass. As the hours stretched, my pace slowed. The forest seemed endless, the terrain unchanging. I kept hoping to find a ridge or clearing where I could see farther, but all I found were more trees. My pack felt like a weight dragging me down, every step harder than the last. By late afternoon, I realized I was dangerously tired. I had been planning the hike for weeks. I wanted to test myself, to go deeper into the mountains than I had before, to spend time alone away from people and the noise of everyday life. I had taken plenty of shorter hikes, a few overnight camping trips too, but never something that really pushed me to my limits. This time I wanted to spend several days out there by myself, carrying everything I needed, moving through long stretches of trail that didn't see many people. I studied the maps, checked the weather patterns, and packed carefully. I thought I was ready. The morning I left, the air was cool and the sky was clear. I parked my car at a small dirt pull-off where the trailhead began, locked up, and shouldered my pack. The first part of the trail cut through thick forest. The air smelled of damp pine needles and earth. Sunlight came in patches through the trees, and the ground was covered with roots and rocks. My pack felt heavy but manageable. I walked at an easy pace, getting used to the weight and the rhythm of my steps. The trail gradually climbed higher, winding through ridges. Every now and then I stopped to drink water and adjust the straps of my pack. I could hear birds calling, the distant sound of a woodpecker tapping against a tree. For hours it was just steady hiking, the sound of my boots on dirt, my breathing, the rustle of branches when the wind picked up. By late afternoon, I had made it to a clearing where I set up my tent for the first night. The spot wasn't official, just a flat space near some trees where I could lay out my gear. I boiled water on my small stove and ate a dehydrated meal. I wrote a few notes in my journal, mostly about how quiet it was, how good it felt to be away from everything. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped quickly. I crawled into my sleeping bag and listened to the forest. The wind hissed softly through the branches, and every so often I heard something moving in the underbrush. It was probably rabbits or raccoons, but being alone made every noise feel sharper, like something was watching me. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke early, ate some oatmeal, and packed up. My plan was to push deeper into the trail where I had read there were fewer visitors. The day started fine. The climb was steep in places, and the sun came down hard, making me sweat through my shirt. I kept drinking water, rationing it carefully because I knew it would be a while before I reached a stream to refill. As the hours went by, I noticed how still the woods felt. No voices, no other hikers, not even the faint sound of a plane overhead. Just the crunch of my boots and the occasional caw of a crow. At first I enjoyed it, but as the day stretched on, the silence felt heavy. When I stopped to rest, the forest pressed in on me. I caught myself looking around too much, scanning the trees, listening harder than I should have. I told myself it was just nerves, but something about being so deep in without seeing another soul made me uneasy. Late that afternoon, I reached a narrow ridge where the trail thinned out. On one side, the land dropped steeply into dense trees. On the other, it sloped down into rocks. I moved carefully, steadying myself with trekking poles. The air had turned cooler, and I could smell rain coming. By the time I found a flat area large enough for my tent, The sky was darkening. I set up quickly, and just as I finished, the rain began. The sound of it hitting the nylon above me was loud, steady, and endless. I cooked inside the vestibule, ate quietly, then lay back in my bag listening. The rain went on for hours. At some point in the night, I woke to a sharp sound outside. Not rain, but something heavier, like branches snapping. My heart jumped. I lay still, holding my breath, straining to hear. For a while, it was quiet again except for rain dripping. Then another snap, closer this time. Something large was moving out there. I gripped my knife and waited. Minutes dragged by, and eventually the noise faded. The next day, I saw tracks near my camp. They weren't human. They were wide, pressed deep into the wet soil. Probably a bear. That thought sank in heavy. I had food with me, sealed and stored away, but I knew bears could still smell it. I moved out quickly, pushing further along the trail, putting distance between me and that spot. The trail grew rougher. I had to climb over fallen logs, navigate mud that sucked at my boots. The forest here felt darker, thicker, like the canopy blocked out most of the sky. Every sound echoed. I tried to focus on the map and the trail markers, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I found a small rise to camp on, hoping the elevation would give me a better sense of security. I set up my tent, ate sparingly, and tried to relax, but my nerves were frayed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of branches made me tense. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps circling the camp. Not animal padding, but heavier, slower, like someone moving carefully. I froze, listening so hard my ears rang. I never unzipped the tent to check. I just lay there until dawn. When morning came, I stepped outside and looked for signs. The ground was disturbed in places, but it was hard to tell if it was animals or not. I told myself it had to be animals. Still, the fear clung to me. The following day was the hardest. The trail became barely visible in spots, forcing me to backtrack and search for markers. The woods seemed endless, the silence pressing. My legs burned from the effort, and my water was running low. I finally reached a stream by late afternoon and drank greedily, then refilled my bottles. While crouching there, I noticed movement across the water. A figure slipped behind the trees. My stomach dropped. It was quick, almost too quick, but I knew what I saw. Person. Not close enough to see detail, but tall enough, human-shaped. I froze in place, heart pounding. I waited, watching the trees. Nothing moved. Eventually, I forced myself to move on, but I couldn't shake it. As I hiked further, I kept checking behind me. The trail was empty, but my skin crawled. I didn't stop to camp until the light was almost gone. I picked a place off the main trail, hidden behind a cluster of rocks and trees, hoping to stay out of sight. I barely ate. My hands shook while setting up the tent. That night was worse than the others. I heard noises again, heavier than before. Twigs breaking, leaves crunching. At one point, I was sure I heard breathing just outside the tent. I held my knife, barely blinking, waiting for something to happen. Nothing came in, but the noises went on and off all night. I got almost no sleep. By morning, I had made up my mind to cut the trip short. I needed to get out. I packed quickly, barely eating, and started back toward the trailhead. The walk felt endless. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I imagined someone there, just out of sight. My nerves were shot, my body sore, my feet blistered. As the hours dragged by, I finally reached familiar ground. I recognized parts of the trail from my first day, and relief started to seep in. But just as I thought I was safe, I found fresh footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, headed the same direction as me. My stomach turned cold. Whoever was out here was between me and the exit. I didn't stop. I forced my legs to keep moving, heart hammering the whole way. The trail wound down toward the lot, and as I broke through the final stretch of trees, I saw my car. My knees almost gave out from relief. I unlocked it with shaking hands, threw my pack inside, and climbed in. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees and watch me leave. No one did. The road curved, the forest fell away, and finally it was just me and the hum of the engine. I never figured out who or what had been out there with me. Maybe it was just my nerves, maybe a hunter, maybe someone living rough in the woods. Whatever it was, I know I wasn't alone on that trail. The silence, the tracks, the noises at night, the figure by the stream, they weren't my imagination. I had gone out there for peace and challenge, but what I found was fear that clung to me long after I left. I haven't gone back since. I had planned this hiking trip for weeks, maybe even months if I was honest with myself. The idea came to me one night when I couldn't sleep. I had been working long hours, spending too much time staring at screens, and I felt like I needed to get away from all of it. My body felt tired, my head felt heavy all the time, and I wanted something that would push me out of my comfort zone. Hiking alone seemed like the answer. I picked a trail in the mountains, not too far from home, but far enough that I wouldn't run into many people. It was one of those lesser-known trails, tucked off a service road that most people drove past without noticing. The trail wasn't dangerous on paper. It didn't have a reputation for people getting lost, and it wasn't full of cliffs or technical climbs. But it was remote, and that was the part that drew me in. I woke up before sunrise on the day of the hike. I had packed everything the night before. My backpack with extra food, a water filter, a small tent in case I decided to stay overnight, a flashlight, and a knife I had no real experience using but thought might be useful. I checked the weather twice before leaving. Clear skies, mild temperature, nothing to worry about. Driving out to the trailhead, I passed through small towns that were still half asleep. The gas stations were just opening. A few trucks passed me, heading the opposite way. As the sun came up, I started to see the outline of the mountains in the distance. They looked massive, almost like walls that blocked off the rest of the world. The dirt road to the trailhead was rougher than I expected. My car wasn't made for off-road driving, and I felt every rock under the tires. By the time I finally parked, I was already feeling a little uneasy. I hadn't seen another car for miles. The parking lot was empty, just a flat patch of dirt with a faded sign that had the trail name on it. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and listened. It was quiet, so quiet that it almost hurt my ears. I could hear the crunch of my boots on gravel, the creak of my backpack when I lifted it onto my shoulders, and nothing else. No traffic, no people, no sound of phones buzzing. Just silence and the faint rustle of trees in the breeze. The trail started out wide and easy, a dirt path lined with pine trees. I walked with energy, feeling good about my choice. The air smelled fresh, like pine needles and damp earth. Birds hopped between branches, and I felt the sun warming my back. It was peaceful, but as the hours went on, the trail began to change. It narrowed, weaving through rocks and brush. The ground became uneven, sloping down one side into a steep drop and up the other side into thick trees. I had to pay more attention to where I put my feet. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how isolated I was. The trees grew closer together, and the light dimmed. At one point, I stopped to drink water and check my map. The trail was marked, but the paper looked old. The ink faded. I compared it to what I saw around me. It matched well enough, so I kept going. I told myself not to overthink it. By midday, I was sweating hard. The sun beat down through gaps in the trees, and my shirt stuck to my back. I found a flat rock and sat down to eat a granola bar. As I rested, I realized how still everything was again. The wind had died down, and I couldn't hear any birds anymore. Just my own breathing and the sound of the wrapper as I opened it. It made me feel exposed, like the forest was holding its breath. After eating, I kept moving, but the trail grew even narrower. At times, it was no wider than my boots, hugging the side of a ridge. On my right was a steep slope covered in loose rocks that went straight down into a dry riverbed. On my left was a wall of stone and roots. I had to press myself against the wall and shuffle forward carefully. That was when I started to feel something I hadn't expected. Fear. Not the kind of fear that comes with sudden danger, but the slow, steady kind that creeps in when you realize how alone you are, how one wrong step could be the end of you. I told myself to stay calm. I checked my pack again. I had food, water, gear. I wasn't lost, not yet. I just needed to keep moving forward. But the trail kept twisting and dropping, leading me deeper. Hours passed, and I didn't see any sign of another person. No footprints, no broken branches that looked fresh. Nothing. The forest felt untouched, almost hostile. Eventually, I came to a section of trail that looked different. The ground was soft, muddy in places, with deep grooves carved into it. At first, I thought it might be from water runoff, but the longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't natural. They were tracks, large, uneven, pressed deep into the soil. I couldn't tell what had made them, but they didn't look like shoe prints. They were too wide, too irregular. I froze there for a while, staring at them. The forest around me was silent. My throat felt dry even though I had just drunk water. I forced myself to move past them, telling myself it could have been an animal. Bears, maybe, or something else. I didn't know enough to tell, and not knowing made it worse. The trail kept climbing, and soon I was sweating again, my legs burning. I stopped less often because every time I did, I felt exposed. My eyes darted to every shadow, every dark patch between trees. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like something was missing, like I should be hearing more but wasn't. By late afternoon, I was tired, but I knew I needed to find a place to stop. I hadn't planned on staying overnight, but the trail had taken longer than I expected. My map wasn't as helpful anymore. The lines blurred, the landmarks didn't match what I saw. I decided to set up camp near a small clearing off the trail. I pitched my tent quickly, hands shaking a little more than I wanted to admit. As the sun dipped lower, the trees cast long shadows across the clearing. I cooked a small meal with my camp stove, but I had no appetite. I kept listening, waiting for some sign of life, but the forest stayed dead quiet. When darkness finally settled, it was complete. No glow from towns, no headlights from distant roads, just blackness. My flashlight beam seemed weak against it. I sat inside my tent, zipped up tight, and tried to tell myself I was fine. But every snap of a twig outside, every rustle of leaves, made my chest tighten. I hardly slept that night. I lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent, listening. At some point, I thought I heard movement, slow, heavy steps somewhere in the woods. My body went cold. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but it faded, or maybe I imagined it. When morning came, I packed quickly, eager to leave. My stomach hurt from not eating much, but I just wanted to move. The trail looked different in daylight, brighter, less threatening, but I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. As I hiked back, I noticed details I had missed. The way the mud was disturbed in long stretches, the way branches were bent and snapped high up, out of reach for me. The tracks I had seen before showed up again in patches. They seemed to follow parts of the trail. The farther I went, the more I wanted to run, but I forced myself to keep a steady pace. Running would only burn me out faster. I kept glancing over my shoulder, heart racing every time I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Most of the time, it was just branches swaying, but not always. At one point, I heard rocks clatter down the slope behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand even though it was daylight. The slope was empty, but loose stones were still rolling, settling at the bottom. Something had moved up there. The rest of the hike felt endless. My legs ached, my pack dug into my shoulders, and my throat was dry even after drinking water. The sun moved higher, then lower again, and I still hadn't reached the trailhead. I began to worry I had taken a wrong turn, that I had followed the wrong path somewhere. Finally, hours later, I saw the dirt road through the trees. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. My car was still there, alone in the empty lot. I stumbled toward it, dropped my pack in the trunk, and sat behind the wheel, hands shaking. I drove out as fast as I dared on the rough road, not stopping until I was back on pavement. Only then did I let myself breathe normally. When I finally got home, I thought about what had happened. Nothing touched me, Nothing attacked me. Nothing physical kept me from leaving. But I couldn't shake the fear. The silence, the tracks, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a monster story. It was just the reality of being alone in the wilderness, far away from anyone who could help if something went wrong. That trail was real, and so was the fear that grew in me mile by mile. I knew I would never hike it again, not alone, not after the way it made me feel. Some places are beautiful, but they don't want you there. And when you realize that too late, the only thing you can do is hope you make it back out. I had been planning a solo hike for weeks. I wanted something that would push me out of my comfort zone but still feel manageable. I had always liked being out in nature, but I was used to marked trails, weekend trips, and places where other people were never too far away. That summer, I told myself I needed to do something harder, something that would make me rely only on myself. After going through maps and reading about different places, I decided on a long trail that crossed through dense forest, steep ridges, and a remote valley before looping back. It wasn't the most dangerous place, but it was long, and people said parts of it felt endless. That was exactly what I wanted. The morning I started, the sky was pale with the first light, and the air was cool. I parked my car near the trailhead, locked everything up, shouldered my heavy backpack, and told myself this was just walking, just one step after another. I carried food, a tent, extra clothes, water, a filter, a knife, a small first aid kit, and my phone with a power bank. I also had a printed map in case the phone lost signal. The weight of the pack pressed into my shoulders, but the excitement of starting kept me moving fast. At first, the trail felt friendly. It wound through tall pines, the kind that let light pass in soft rays that lit the ground in patches. Birds called back and forth, and the ground was dry but easy to walk on. My boots crunched on fallen needles. I followed the path without thinking, breathing in the sharp smell of pine sap. Hours passed like that. When I stopped for a quick snack, I felt calm, like I had finally found the peace I'd been chasing in the city. By midday, the sun grew hot, and the trail began to climb. The path narrowed, the air heavier with the smell of dirt and plants. The trees crowded tighter, cutting off the view of the sky. I felt sweat sliding down my back, soaking my shirt, and the straps of my pack rubbed my shoulders raw. The climb stretched on, turning steeper with each bend. My thighs burned, and my breath came in short gasps. I kept telling myself to just keep going until the trail leveled again. I wanted to reach a ridge I had seen on the map, a high point with a view of the valley. That was my first goal. When I finally reached the ridge, it was already late afternoon. The view was wide, showing layers of hills and green forest that rolled on forever. It should have been beautiful, and part of me did feel awe, but there was also something unsettling about how big and empty it all looked. I couldn't see any houses, any smoke, any roads, just endless trees. I stood there, chewing a granola bar, and I remember how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that presses into your ears until you hear your own heartbeat. I still had hours of daylight left, but I knew I needed to pick a place to set up camp before night. The map showed a stream further down, so I started the descent. That part of the trail was rougher. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and the trees grew wild, with thick undergrowth scratching my arms. I stumbled more than once, catching myself with my hands and feeling the sting of small cuts. By the time I reached the bottom, I was sore and tired, and the sun was already sinking low. The stream was narrow but enough for water. I set my pack down on a flat patch of dirt not far from it and pitched my small tent. The motions were familiar. Unroll, snap poles together, anchor the corners. I boiled water with my small stove and ate a meal that tasted better than it should have. As the sky darkened, I filled my bottle and let myself relax. The sound of the stream was steady, covering small noises in the woods. When I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, I felt secure in that thin nylon shelter, even though I knew it wasn't real protection. That night, I slept lightly. The forest came alive in the dark, branches cracking, rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. Every sound pulled me awake, heart beating fast. Once, I swore I heard heavy steps close to the tent. My body froze. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing happened. The sound faded. I told myself it was a deer and forced myself to stay still until sleep came again. When dawn finally lit the fabric of the tent, I felt relief wash over me. The next day, I packed up and followed the trail deeper. It became less clear, winding through tall ferns and uneven ground. Sometimes the markers were just faint paint on a tree, and I had to stop and look hard to find them. The map said the loop would curve and head back after crossing the valley, but walking it made me realize how far I had gone. Each step felt like it pulled me away from safety. My shoulders ached constantly, and my feet throbbed inside my boots. Blisters formed on my heels. I tried to ignore them, but each step sent sharp pain up my legs. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather. They thickened fast, turning the sky gray. Wind shook the branches overhead. I realized I might be caught in a storm, and I had no shelter ready. The trail sloped down into the valley, but the air grew cooler, and the first drops of rain fell. I quickened my pace, but the ground turned slick, mud clinging to my boots. Thunder rumbled. I knew I needed to stop and set up before it got worse. I found a small clearing and hurried to pitch my tent as the rain came harder, soaking through my clothes, chilling me. By the time I crawled inside, everything was damp, including my sleeping bag. I lay there shivering, listening to rain hammer on the fabric. Water pooled under the tent floor, soaking my mat. That night was long. I barely slept, teeth chattering, the smell of wet earth filling the air. When morning came, the rain had stopped, but fog hung thick between the trees. Everything dripped. My clothes were clammy when I pulled them on, and my pack felt twice as heavy. I was exhausted already, but I had no choice but to keep going. The trail almost disappeared in places. Fog blurred everything into the same gray-green shapes. My map was damp, edges tearing. I tried to follow the markings, but some were faded or hidden. More than once, I walked the wrong way before realizing and had to backtrack. Each mistake drained me. Hunger gnawed at me, but I was rationing food carefully now. I had packed enough, but being wet and cold made me burn through energy faster. As I moved deeper into the valley, I noticed how silent it was. Even birds seemed absent. The trees grew closer, blocking out light, and the ground was uneven, with roots twisting everywhere. My boots slipped often, and my legs ached with every climb. I started to feel watched, even though I knew no one was out here. Every crack of a branch made me whip my head around. The forest pressed in, endless and uncaring. Late in the day, I reached a point where the trail forked, or at least looked like it. One path curved left, another right. The map didn't show a fork here. My chest tightened. I stood there, staring back and forth, unsure. Finally, I picked the left. I told myself I could always turn back if it felt wrong. Hours later, the ground grew steeper, climbing instead of leveling. My gut told me something was off. I checked my compass against the map, and dread filled me. I had gone the wrong way, deeper into the hills instead of across the valley. Turning back meant hours more walking, but I had no choice. The sun was already dipping low. Panic rose in me. I pushed faster, legs shaking, trying to retrace my steps, but in the fog and dim light, everything looked the same. My stomach dropped when I realized I couldn't find the fork again. I was lost. The fear hit hard. My chest felt tight, and my breaths came sharp. I forced myself to stop and sit on a rock to calm down. I pulled out the map, but the lines and marks blurred. Nothing matched what I saw around me. I chewed a piece of jerky, but it felt like rubber in my dry mouth. All I could think about was how far I was from anyone, how easy it would be to vanish out here without a trace. I picked a direction and kept walking, but as the light faded, the forest grew darker than I thought possible. Shadows stretched between trunks, and the ground became almost invisible. I stumbled constantly, hands scraped raw from catching myself. Finally, too tired to keep going, I set up the tent in the dark. My hands shook as I fumbled with the poles. When it was up, I crawled inside and lay there, heart hammering, listening to the emptiness outside. That night was worse than before. Every sound was magnified. A branch snapped nearby, and I felt my whole body stiffen. Then another. Heavy steps, or maybe my mind playing tricks. I gripped the knife in my hand, waiting. Hours dragged on. I must have dozed in short bursts, but fear never left. By morning, I was drained, eyes burning from lack of sleep. My food was running lower, and I knew I needed to find my way out soon. I tried to head east, checking the compass often, thinking it would eventually bring me back toward the loop. The ground grew rougher, with fallen trees blocking the way, forcing me to climb over or around them. My arms were covered in scratches. My legs felt weak. I had been planning that hike for months. It wasn't anything too extreme compared to some of the trails I had read about, but it was long, isolated, and the kind of trip that required me to prepare carefully. I chose a route in the northern part of the country where there weren't many people, especially during the season I picked. I wanted solitude. I wanted to push myself further than the short weekend hikes I had done before. I wanted to see how far I could go when it was just me, my pack, and the trail. The trail started near a small parking lot at the base of a mountain range. It was early fall, with the air already sharper and cooler in the mornings, but still warm during the day. The leaves had started to change, bright yellows and deep reds spreading across the slopes. I arrived just after sunrise. The parking lot was empty except for one car. The place felt quiet in a way that made me think of distance, like the nearest person might be miles away. I double-checked my gear. My backpack was heavier than usual since I had packed for 2 nights. A tent, sleeping bag, food, a cooking stove, layers of clothes, a map, compass, and a GPS device. I carried more water than I thought I'd need, plus a filter. I also had a headlamp, flashlight, extra batteries, and a first aid kit. I told myself I was overprepared, but that was better than being underprepared. The trail started wide, covered with gravel, before narrowing into a dirt path that cut steadily upward through the forest. The trees stood tall and close together, their branches creating shifting patterns of light as the sun rose higher. My boots crunched on leaves and small rocks. I breathed in the cool air, heavy with the smell of damp soil and pine. For the first few hours, it felt easy. My body fell into the rhythm of climbing uphill, my arms swinging slightly with the straps of my pack, my legs pushing me forward one step at a time. Birds called in the trees. Occasionally, a squirrel ran across the trail, its claws scratching bark. I passed a stream and stopped to refill one of my bottles, crouching low and feeling the cold water sting against my skin. As the morning went on, the forest began to thin. The trail curved along a ridge, and I could see across the valleys below. Rolling hills stretched far into the distance, their colors muted by a haze of morning mist. I kept moving, stopping only for short breaks to eat a handful of trail mix or take a sip of water. By midday, the sun felt hot against my back. I checked the map and saw that I was about halfway to the point where I planned to camp. I wanted to reach a small clearing by late afternoon. It was marked on the map as a flat area, near a stream, with enough space to set up a tent. I pushed myself forward, following the trail as it began to climb more steeply. The path narrowed, cutting across loose rocks and scree. Each step required focus. My boots slid slightly on the shifting stones, and I had to dig in hard to keep my balance. Sweat ran down my forehead, stinging my eyes. I stopped more often now, leaning on my trekking poles and letting my breath steady before continuing. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. The sound of birds faded. The trees thinned further until they were stunted and twisted, clinging to cracks in the rock. The wind picked up, sharp and steady, rattling through the dry grass that clung to the hillside. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low in the sky. The light had turned golden, stretching long shadows across the ground. The clearing was as the map had shown, flat, grassy, with a trickle of water running nearby. I dropped my pack, my shoulders aching, and began to set up camp. The routine was automatic. Tent first, sleeping bag unrolled, stove set up. I boiled water, poured it into a bag of dehydrated food, and ate slowly, watching the sky shift from orange to purple. The air grew colder, and I layered on a jacket and hat. When night finally fell, it was sudden and heavy. Out here, far from towns or houses, the darkness was complete. I turned on my headlamp and the beam cut through the blackness, catching the edges of rocks and trees. The silence pressed in. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and lay back in my sleeping bag. My body was tired, but my mind buzzed. I listened to every sound outside, the rustle of grass, the occasional snap of a twig, the faint gurgle of the stream. It was nothing unusual, but being alone made each noise sharper, harder to ignore. Eventually, I drifted into sleep. When I woke, it was still dark. At first, I wasn't sure why. The night was silent, except for the faint whistle of wind against the tent fabric. My watch showed it was just after midnight. My throat was dry, so I reached for my water bottle and drank, the sound of swallowing loud in the silence. I lay back down, trying to relax, but then I heard it. A noise, faint at first, but different from the wind or the stream. It was a crunch, deliberate, like a foot pressing down on gravel or dry grass. My body went stiff. I told myself it could be an animal, a deer maybe moving through the clearing. But then it came again, another crunch, closer this time. My heartbeat sped up. I slowly reached for my flashlight, careful not to make noise, and clicked it on. The beam shot through the tent wall, thin and weak, but it was enough to cast shadows outside. I couldn't see anything clear. I turned the light off, lay still, and listened. The sound didn't come again. Minutes passed, long and heavy, until I began to wonder if I had imagined it. Eventually, my eyes grew heavy again and I fell back asleep. The next morning, the ground around my tent looked undisturbed. I convinced myself it really had been an animal passing through. I packed up quickly and got back on the trail. The day was harder than the first. My legs were sore and the trail climbed higher. The rocks grew sharper, the switchbacks tighter. At times I had to scramble with my hands, pulling myself up over ledges. The sun beat down and I could feel my energy draining. I stopped for lunch on a narrow ridge, sitting with my back against a boulder. The drop on either side was steep, the valley floor far below. I chewed slowly, watching the wind ripple across the slopes. It was then I noticed something. Across the valley, on the opposite ridge, there was movement. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow shifting against the rock. But when I squinted, I saw it more clearly. A figure, small with distance but human-shaped, standing still. I froze, food halfway to my mouth. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't shift its weight. Just stood there, facing my direction. My chest tightened. I stared for what felt like minutes. Then a gust of wind blew dust across the ridge, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I sat there, heart pounding. Could have been another hiker, but I hadn't seen anyone since I left the parking lot. The trail wasn't popular. The figure hadn't been carrying a pack, at least none that I could see. I forced myself to keep moving, but the thought of it stuck in my head the rest of the day. Each time I rounded a bend or climbed a ledge, I found myself glancing back, scanning the ridges. By late afternoon, I reached a small plateau where I planned to camp. It wasn't as open as the last spot, but it was flat enough for my tent. I set up quickly, ate a small dinner, and crawled inside as the light faded. That night was worse. I lay awake, tense, every sound amplified in the darkness. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of steps outside, this time closer, circling the tent. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would give me away. I gripped the flashlight and sat frozen, listening. The steps moved slowly, pausing now and then, as if someone was trying to be careful. I wanted to yell, to scare whatever it was away, but fear locked me in place. Then silence. I waited, straining to hear, until finally exhaustion pulled me under again. In the morning, I unzipped the tent slowly. The ground looked normal at first, but then I saw them. Footprints, clear, pressed into the dirt, circling my tent. Not animal prints, boots. My stomach dropped. I packed quickly, barely eating, and started back toward the trail. My plan had been to stay another night, push deeper into the mountains, but now I couldn't. I needed to get back. The trail down felt longer, each step heavier than the last. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the ridges. My nerves were raw, my hands sweaty on the grips of my poles. By late afternoon, I was still far from the parking lot. My legs shook from fatigue. I knew I couldn't make it all the way down before dark, so I had to camp one more night. I chose a spot off the trail, hidden among boulders. I set up the tent quickly, ate little, and climbed inside before the sun was fully gone. I kept my headlamp off, sitting in the darkness, hoping not to draw attention. The night dragged on. Every sound made my skin prickle. Hours passed, my body stiff from lying still. Then I heard it again. The steps, slow, deliberate, moving through the rocks. I set out early in the morning, before the sun had risen above the ridge line. The sky was pale gray and the air was sharp, the kind that makes every breath feel clean and almost metallic in the chest. My backpack felt heavier than it should have, but I told myself it was just the stiffness of morning and that I would settle into the rhythm once I got moving. I had studied the map the night before and decided to try a loop trail that was not often used anymore. A long path that wound through the backcountry and circled around a ridge before dropping back toward the parking area. I wanted the challenge. I wanted the quiet. I also wanted to prove to myself that I could handle a full day out there alone. The trail at the start was wide and well marked. Fallen leaves covered the dirt in a thin blanket that muffled my steps. I could hear the faint stream below me, hidden by brush and boulders, and every so often a bird called from somewhere in the branches. The air was still damp from the night, and my boots made soft, dark prints in the earth. As I climbed higher, the trees began to thin. The slope was gradual at first, but then it pitched upward into switchbacks. My breathing grew heavier, and sweat formed on the back of my neck even though the air was cool. Every bend revealed another stretch upward, and I pushed through it, stopping briefly to take water and shift the straps of my pack. By the time I reached the top of that first climb, the sun had broken free of the clouds. A golden light spilled across the ridge and lit up the valley below. I could see for miles, rolling hills, darker ridges in the distance, and the faint glint of a lake far off to the south. The view gave me a burst of energy. I ate a small snack, tightened my boots, and pressed on. The trail narrowed as I moved deeper into the wilderness. It was clear this section was less used. Grass sprouted in the center of the path, and in places, fallen branches forced me to step over or around them. The silence became heavier. I no longer heard distant road noise or voices. It was just the wind and the steady sound of my boots on soil. I checked my map often, folding it against the compass I carried, making sure I was where I thought I was. Everything seemed to line up, so I kept going. The loop should have been around 15 miles, long but not extreme, something I believed I could finish in a long day if I kept a steady pace. By midday, clouds began to gather. They moved quickly, drifting across the sky in heavy shapes. The light dimmed, and the forest seemed to grow closer around me. The wind came stronger, rattling the treetops, and the air smelled faintly of rain. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach a more open stretch before weather turned bad. The trail dipped into a gully where the ground was damp and soft. My boots sank slightly into the mud. I followed the path upward again, but when I reached the top, I noticed something that unsettled me. The trail markers were faint. A tree that should have been painted with a blaze of color carried only the faintest trace, worn away with time. I slowed down, searching carefully, moving step by step, until I found the next marker deeper in. It reassured me, but it also reminded me that this was not a trail many people used. If anything went wrong, I would be alone for a long time. The rain started as a mist. It dotted my jacket and left darker spots on the dirt. Then it thickened into a steady drizzle. I pulled the hood over my head and kept moving, my steps louder now in the wet earth. The forest smelled stronger, pine, wet leaves, and the deep earthy rot of fallen wood. I walked for what felt like hours under that rain. My legs grew heavy, and my shoulders ached under the straps. When I checked the time, I realized I had covered less distance than I expected. The overgrowth and fallen debris slowed me down. I told myself I just needed to push harder, that the loop would eventually curve back. But then the trail disappeared. It didn't vanish all at once. It simply thinned into nothing. One moment I was stepping between narrow walls of brush, following the faint line in the soil, and the next I was standing in an open stretch where no clear path led forward. I stopped, heart pounding harder than it should, and turned in a slow circle. I saw no markers, just trees pressing in from every side. I pulled out the map again, trying to line up landmarks, but the rain smeared the page, and my compass needle shook slightly in the wind. I thought I had gone straight, but the ground sloped strangely, and nothing seemed to match what I expected. I walked a little farther, hoping the trail would reappear. Didn't. I doubled back, trying to find my last known marker. My footprints were already softening in the mud, blending into the wet ground. The panic began small, a sharp tightness in my chest, and then it spread. I forced myself to slow down, to breathe. I told myself I wasn't lost, just temporarily off track. I needed to think carefully. I chose a direction that seemed most likely to reconnect with the trail and followed it. But the forest grew thicker. The brush scratched against my legs. The ground turned uneven, dropping into shallow pits, climbing again over slick rocks. My boots slipped more than once, and my palms stung from catching myself on rough bark. The rain eased after a while, but the forest was soaked. Every branch dripped. The air felt colder. My clothes clung to my skin. As the light dimmed, I realized how much time I had lost. The sun was hidden, but I knew evening was close. I had not planned to spend a night out here. I had only brought a light jacket, a small first aid kit, snacks, and water. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, nothing for real shelter. I forced myself to keep moving, searching for any sign of trail. My stomach clenched with hunger, but I rationed what I had. The sound of my breathing grew loud in my ears. Every snap of a twig made me spin, heart racing, though I saw nothing but trees and shadows. When night finally came, it came fast. The forest went from dim to nearly black in minutes. My headlamp cut a small circle of light ahead, but beyond that, darkness pressed in. I felt exposed, fragile. The cold crept deeper, settling in my bones. I found a small rise of ground and cleared away some wet leaves. It wasn't much, but it was drier than the low spots. I sat there, knees pulled to my chest, hood tight around my face. Every sound became sharper in the dark. The rustle of leaves, the distant cracking of branches, even the faint drip of water. It all seemed louder, closer. Sleep came only in short bursts. I would drift for a few minutes, then wake with a start, convinced something was near. My muscles stiffened from the cold. My stomach ached from hunger. Time dragged slowly, each hour stretching like a test. When morning came, the forest was gray and heavy with mist. I forced myself to stand, to move. My body felt clumsy, but I couldn't stay still. I needed to find the trail. I tried again, picking a direction and walking steadily. The ground was slick. More than once, I stumbled, sliding on wet rock or sinking into hidden mud. My legs shook from fatigue, but I pushed on. I thought I heard water and followed the sound. Sure enough, a stream cut through the forest, narrow but steady. I drank from it, the cold water burning down my throat. I filled my bottle, knowing it could keep me going for a while longer. The stream gave me a sense of direction. I followed it downstream, hoping it would lead to a larger body of water, maybe even toward civilization. But it wound endlessly through trees and rocks, twisting back on itself, giving no sign of where it might end. Hours passed. My feet ached. My jacket was torn from branches. My hands were raw. I began to feel lightheaded, my thoughts less sharp. I stumbled more often, catching myself with a curse of pain each time. By the second night, I was weaker. I had no food left. I curled under a fallen tree for some shelter, shivering as the wind slid through the gaps. My stomach cramped, and my lips felt cracked and dry despite the water I had. Sleep was worse this time. Each noise felt threatening. At one point, something moved in the brush nearby, a steady rustling, heavier than a rabbit or bird. My chest froze. I held still, gripping a stick I had picked up earlier. The sound came closer, then paused, then drifted away. I never saw what it was. When dawn came again, I felt hollow. My legs trembled with every step. But then, faintly, I saw something that made my heart lurch. A piece of wood, cut clean, not broken naturally. I stumbled toward it, and beyond, I saw a faint line in the grass. A trail. It was rough and overgrown, but it was there. I almost cried with relief. I followed it, forcing myself forward despite exhaustion. The trail widened gradually. The signs of human use became clearer. Faded paint on trees, old boot marks hardened in dry patches. I walked faster, stumbling but refusing to stop. Hours later, the trees parted, and I saw it. A dirt